Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to 4S Banquet 2003. Special welcome to Harriet Zuckerman, Martin Elton, Barbara Edge, Gordon, and Alistair Edge. Like every year, we will celebrate at the end of the banquet the accomplishments of the Society and of the field of social studies of science, medicine and technology by awarding prizes and observing that it has been a good year. It has also been a very tragic year in which we lost several colleagues and members of the Society. Rob Kling, who was a very active 4S member, died after submitting his paper to this conference. Rob worked throughout his career to bring influence from STS into the field of information sciences and computing. Tomorrow, his paper will be read by his co-author in the 8:30 session in the Highlands room. Earlier this year, 3 past presidents of the Society and founders of the field died. I will honor Robert Merton, Dorothy Nelkin and David Edge in a commemoration speech later tonight. For this moment, I wish you bon appetit. Postpone your ordering bottles of wine until later. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, the death of Robert Merton, Dorothy Nelkin and David Edge mean a large loss to the Society of Social Studies of Science. It means a loss to many dear friends. It means the loss of many dear friends. To many of you, it means the loss of founders and intellectual testators to the Society. The loss leaves a personal gap for many of us, but it does not leave an intellectual gap, at least not in an unbridgeable form. The lives of Bob Merton, Dot Nelkin and David Edge were by far not unfulfilled. They have played crucial roles in the founding of the Society and in the shaping of the field of social studies of science, technology and medicine. They have proved the giants, they have provided the giants' shoulders on which we stand and look ahead. Robert King Merton died on the 23rd of February 2003 at the age of 92. He was the first president of our society. Robert Merton is by all standards the founder of the field of social studies of science. As Jonathan Cole and Harriet Zuckerman show in their 1975 article on the emergence of scientific specialty, the self-exemplifying case of the sociology of science, the social studies of science did have a long and desultory incubation before the field, then seen as a specialty of sociology, finally took shape according to all the parameters that the sociology of science provided for its self-analysis. 3 measures show the emergence of the new field between the 1950s and 1970s in quantitative terms. One, the increasing number of sociologists labeling themselves as being interested in the sociology of knowledge and of science. Two, the increasing number of publications. And three, the decreasing average age of its participants. Robert Merton was the central figure in this process. Merton's 1957 presidential address to the American Sociological Association can be seen as starting a campaign for establishing the sociology of science as a scientific specialty. He observed, and I quote, "We can only guess what historians of the future will say about the condition of present-day sociology, but it seems safe to anticipate that they will observe that it remained too little cultivated in a world where science loomed large enough to present mankind with the choice of destruction or survival." He led the way to redress this flaw, and he did so by contributing a large number of now classical articles, by training the first generation of sociologists of science, and by building the necessary institutions. It is difficult to overestimate the intellectual impact of Merton on the sociology of science. First of all, he did have an enormous impact on all social and behavioral sciences. Concepts such as theories of the middle range and the insiders-outsiders perspective have become part of the standard methodological vocabulary of the social sciences. And Merton's concept of self-fulfilling prophecy even became a term in common English, and indeed in its original English form in other languages such as Dutch. But also within the sociology of science and of knowledge, Merton's legacy is large and lasting. Having used quantitative analyses in his dissertation in the 1930s, Merton is one of the arch-fathers of scientometrics. It's only fair, though, to recognize that in the 1960s it was Harriet Tuckerman, herself leader in the field of sociology of science and past president of the society, that led him that way. That his functional analysis of science became a take-off point in the 1980s for the sociology of scientific knowledge, and that it is still ritually cited as such, only underlines the stature of this man as one of the field's original giants. There is no doubt that for anyone entering the field of science studies, even today, the first scholar whose work one has to deal with is Robert Merton. His work, for example, on the norms of science has become an obligatory point of passage for everyone. At least as important as Merton's scholarly contributions to the sociology of science are his social and institutional contributions. Bob Merton created the field almost in a physical sense by training a host of graduates. His students formed an important part of the first generation of sociologists of science and of the members of this society, and many of them are indeed here in this room tonight. Tom Gearing describes Merton in lecture was jazz, but not in free fall. Although I was not one of these students in Columbia, also my entry into STS was strongly influenced by Merton's work. It was his Science, Technology and Society in the 17th Century England, his Harvard dissertation published in 1938, that helped me to make an empirical turn from the philosophy of science to the social studies of science and technology, resulting in my first refereed publication in Dutch. And in addition to his scholarly work and his teaching, Merton played an equally constitutive role in building the field institutionally. Although I wasn't there at the time, it seems obvious that he became the first president of the Society for Social Studies of Science once it was created in 1975. Robert Merton received the Burnell Award in 1982. Dorothy Nelkin died on the 28th May 2003 at the age of 69. She was a founding member of the Society and its third president from 1978 to 1979. She epitomizes the multidisciplinarity and the broadness of the field of science, technology and society studies as it has developed from its early stage as a specialty of sociology. Cornell University made her a full professor in the Department of Sociology and in the program on Science, Technology and Society, although she only held a BA. She was then awarded the most prestigious university professorship at the University of York and a joint appointment in the law school. Clearly, Dot Nelkin was difficult to pin down in one disciplinary box. A BA in philosophy, an appointment in sociology, gone native into the tribe of physicists by marrying the distinguished Cornell physicist Mark Nelkin, then a professor of law and a university professor. Demonstrating how this broadness was strength rather than weakness, she was one of the pioneering scholars in our field who broadened the social studies of science, technology and medicine beyond the confines of sociology. Dorothy Nelkin's research encompasses the full range of themes that is currently addressed in modern science and technology studies, and her pioneering work paved the way, certainly in retrospect, for almost every one of them. From political controversies over nuclear power to legal controversies over creationism in schools, from a public understanding of science and science journalism to the role of science and technology in pop culture, as, for example, in molecular art. The interest in controversies and in the tensions around science and technology and society is the core theme in Dorothy Nelkin's work. But there is more. As Susan Lindy, one of her co-authors, wrote in a recent tribute, she was not only studying controversies, she also participated and even created them. Dorothy Nelkin was, in addition to a fine scholar and very productive author, a public intellectual too. Her work on dangerous diagnostics, for example, with Lawrence Tankredi, questions the politics embedded in diagnostic tests and imaging technologies and the resulting invasion of institutional power into the personal lives of patients. Her most important contribution to building the field of STS has thus been, for me, to combine political motivation with scholarly analysis, to add societal and controversial issues to the STS agenda, to engage as STS researcher actively in public debates. But, however broad-ranging her interests were, from science to politics, from technology to journalism, from molecular art to playing the cello, she always remained the curious and inquisitive scholar addressing new issues and asking unsettling questions. In next year's spring issue of Science, Technology and Human Values, you will find Dorothy Nelkin's last piece, published posthumously. In this article, titled God Talk, she observes American geneticists' increasing use of religious metaphors. The genome is called the Book of Life, the Holy Grail, or even the Bible. And DNA is called the sacred text, or the master code. She then analyzes this God talk as part of a growing effort to reconcile the difference between science and religion. Dorothy Nelkin concludes, and I quote, "The God talk, the cosmic claims, the organizations for dialogue and reconciliation are all ways to minimize the distance between science and religion, to answer the accusation of critics and to compete for credibility in the public domain. But using such images to buttress the power of science and technology may ultimately pose risks. Risks for the autonomy of science, the role of religion, and the social well-being. This is Dot Nalkin at her best, engaging in controversy, critically analyzing the contents of scientific discourse, but also warning for a demise of the autonomy and independence of science. Dorothy Nalkin was awarded the Burnell Award in 1988. David Edge died on the 28th of January 2003 at the age of 70. I met David for the first time during a 1983 workshop in Amsterdam on teaching STS to science students and to secondary school science classes. I found myself sitting next to him and was awe-struck. Trevor Pinch and I had recently submitted our first joint article to Social Studies of Science, and I had no idea what would be proper behavior under these circumstances. With his typical skill of teacher and coach, David made this anxiety quickly fade, and I guess that our common roots in physics and our shared passion for teaching did help too. With his disciplinary background in physics, David Edge epitomizes a crucial element in the foundations of the society and the field. He showed in his Astronomy Transformed with Michael Mulcahy how an in-depth knowledge of science could contribute to sociological analysis of, in this case, the emergence of a scientific specialty. This explains, I think, why David felt it almost as a personal insult when, for example, in the infamous Science Wars, STS scholarship was accused of not understanding science, of not taking science serious, and even of attacking science. Also in his role as teacher, David Edge played a central role in the social studies of science. He established the famous Science Studies Unit in Edinburgh, of course, but was also and remained actively committed to secondary school science teaching and to setting up and supporting other university STS centers, for example, as external examiner in the United Kingdom. Beyond any doubt, David Edge did have his most fundamental, constitutive and lasting effect on the field of social studies of science, technology and medicine in his role as founding editor of the journal Social Studies of Science. Having established the journal in 1970 with Roy McLeod, David was the sole chief editor and Mr. 3S since 1991, until Mike Lynch succeeded him last year. Endless are the accounts of how young researchers, many of them present in this room, not so young anymore, submitted their first article to SSS and were coached by David through the revise and resubmit process. Endless are the accounts of how David Edge edited, sometimes almost rewrote, an article once it had been accepted. Endless are the stories how he brought out the best in an author's scholarship without interfering with the basic intellectual message. David Edge succeeded, with the help of his circle of collaborating editors, advisors and referees, to create a journal that was open to sometimes radically new ideas and approaches, but at the same time maintained a very high standard of scholarly quality. This has been crucially significant for the shaping of the field of social studies of science, technology and medicine. Evidently, David Edge's teaching skills and passion prepared him well for this editorship. I think, however, that much more important than his copy editing and style improving pencil was his personal attitude of a compassionate and truly humanist mentor. He pointed more by example than explicitly to fundamental values beyond professional scholarship. He did so in what he and I mockingly called his sermons, such as last year's contribution to the President's plenary. He did so in his role of eminence grise in our society, for example by serving for many years on the Brunel Award Committee, including this year's for the last time. I cannot recall one 4S meeting without him and his wife. You, Barbara, probably have been to more 4S meetings than any other person in this room. It was David's human compassion that made him into this unique and foundational editor, that made him play music at a plenary session in Bielefeld, that made him read the following lines from T.S. Eliot's 4 Quartets last year. Who then devised the torment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame, which human power cannot remove. We only live, only suspire, consumed by either fire or fire. If you allow me to come full circle around, David Edge was the personification of Merton's norms of science. David Edge received the Society's Brunel Award in 1993. It is impossible to do justice in one commemoration speech to the richness of these 3 lives and to the importance of their contributions to the field and to our society. I must refer you to the wealth of wonderful memories, observations, and commentaries that have been published in many obituaries, in memoriams, and tributes. In addition, special sessions are planned for next year's joint meeting of the 4S and the East. Still, this commemoration seemed necessary at this one annual moment when we are together as members of the Society of Social Studies of Science. Although I do feel sad for the loss of these great scholars, gratitude for what they did for the field and for the society prevails. Standing on their shoulders, we do look farther, we do move forward. I will close with some music. Bob Merton's lectures were like jazz. Doc Nelken would have enjoyed playing its cello opening bars. And I know David Edge loved it. After a minute of silence, I will honor these 3 founders of our field with the finale from Scott Joplin's jazz opera, Premonition. It starts with melancholic lines in the strings, but then builds up strength and finishes on a high note, confidently directed towards the future. The key words are marching onward, marching onward, marching to that lovely tune, marching onward, happy as a bird in June. Sliding onward, listen to that rag, move along, don't stop dancing, drag along, doing the real slow drag. May I ask you to stand up and commemorate Robert Merton, Dorothy Nelken, and David Edge with 1 minute of silence. The prizes, and for the first time in the history of 4S, you already know the names. I want to thank a few crucial people that helped to make this conference in what I hope will be a big success. First of all, Roland Baal, who was the chair of the program committee. He must be here. There was a whole program committee behind Roland, who I think also in his name, but the chair, in 4S, the chair does most of the work. Secondly, I would very much like to thank the conference staff of Paul Walters, who has now been organizing our 4S meetings for so many years that the three of them become part of the society. Thank you, Paul. And finally, the outgoing council members, Hugh Gusterson, Steve Epstein and Sarah Franklin, who all worked very hard, and you will see some of that hard work when the prize committees present their work, and realize that there are piles as high as this of books and as high as that of papers that they have read. They sat down, we thank them very warmly for their service. May I then now ask Ulrike Veld to come forward to present the Mullins Prize.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking tonight in the name of the committee, which consisted of Steve Hilgardner, Jane Summerton and myself. And I now have the pleasure to announce you that this year's Mullins Prize goes to Mark Dewing from Cornell University for his essay Lab Hands and Scarlett O on models, identities and performances. I was asked to say a few words about the paper, and I thought I should give two versions of my few words. The first version is a very personal one and doesn't die the other members of the committee in what I was saying now. I personally like the paper very much, and when I say I like it, it's some kind of feeling which is between the brain and the stomach, because my stomach gets small sometimes when I have to read the papers. And sometimes it just relaxes, and so it's not really objectivized feeling about the paper. I liked it because he didn't try to prove me that he has read everything he needed to read. But he tried to kind of seduce me, get me into it, and maybe it was part of my first life as a physicist which kind of seduced me in this paper. This was the kind of first version of what I would like to say. The second version is the kind of more official one that sounds like that. We believe that Bark managed insightfully to explore the tensions between different ways of receiving knowledge production and its relation to professional identities and everyday politics in the lab. He skillfully draws the reader into his own personal experiences in being initiated to the work of the lab. His interactions with technicians and scientists become the basis for analyzing how technical and social order are co-constituted and how identities are performed. His particular and very personal style made us engage with his narrative, enter the lab with him, and feel all the different levels of what he would label the primary point of his paper, namely to challenge the different claims of operators and scientists regarding their knowledge-producing capabilities in the lab setting. Congratulations, Park. Would you come up, please?
A brief performance by Park Ewing. For those of you who know me or are familiar with some of my work, it will come as no surprise that I wish to use this minute at the podium to give, like my able presenter, 2 speeches at once. In the first speech, I would like to thank the Society, and I would like to thank my parents, Park and Erica Ewing. I am honored and humbled that such an ordinary person as myself would be so recognized by this group of thinking people. In the second speech, I would like to profess a certain disappointment in myself. You see, I thought that with the form and content of the paper, that I had written myself out of this competition, and I was looking forward to taking up a sort of want-to-be iconoclast status, railing against the prison walls of the conventions of the Society. Yet here I am, and very thankful to the Society for this honor. So I had to ask myself, what happened? What went wrong? And I thought about it, and it finally occurred to me that the 4S is a society of, by, and for revolutionaries. And the people in this room have been kicked out of every decent society around, precisely because prevailing against the conventions of those traditional groups. So then the question is, how do you revolutionize a group of revolutionaries? Well, at this point, I don't know. But I vow to continue to try my ordinary best, and I encourage my colleagues, both those younger and those more experienced, to do the same. I look forward to perhaps in the future taking up a position as an iconoclast against the stifling and staid traditions of the field. Of course, I will keep this speech handy should I ever have the good fortune and honor of recycling it. Thank you very much.
May I ask you, Gustafsson, to present the Carson Prize?
My son over there will provide sound effects. The Forest website describes the Rachel Carson Prize as for a work of social or political relevance. Created in 1996, it says, a prize is awarded annually for a book-length work of social or political relevance in the area of social studies of science and technology. Nominations that provide a new perspective or a feminist or minority voice are especially encouraged. Last year's Carson Prize Committee chose the winner from a pool of 45 books that survived an initial screening. The committee worked in 2 phases. Steve Epstein, Sarah Franklin, and I produced a short list of 10 books. For the selection of the final winner, Sarah Franklin, who could not attend last year's 4S meeting, was replaced by Bibi Banquet. When you have to give a laudatory speech a year after you pick the winner, you inevitably agonize about the wisdom of your selection. So this week I decided to verify the good taste and fine judgment of our expert panel by checking our opinions against those of a different but more influential body of experts. That strange group of people who have the time to write unpaid, unsolicited online reviews for Amazon.com. Here are some of their comments, which Simon will find of interest. One under the heading, "Exciting but theoretically disappointing," said, "I looked forward to this book with much anticipation, perhaps too much, as I ended up being almost thoroughly disappointed. One could give Cole a little credit for bringing up some lesser known but interesting points, but still, this is not really anything new to those that have read the literature. A friend of mine suggested that perhaps my criticism is too harsh, considering that this book is most likely his dissertation, and thus not as polished as a second or third book. I don't feel like this is an excuse for lazy or sloppy work, however, and so I can only give this book a mediocre rating at best." Amazon.com lists this person as at Harvard Law School. I hope Simon and I aren't speaking terms after this. Another reviewer said, "Cole makes good points, but it is important to note that he is a polemicist and not an expert. He was to give evidence in the People versus James Hyatt case before Honorable Michael J. Brennan, the Supreme Court of the State of New York. The judge conducted a pre-trial Friday hearing on the issue and concluded that Cole's evidence would not be permitted since it constitutes junk science. Cole conceded that his theories hadn't been sufficiently tested to know whether they could be considered science, but rather his opinion is based merely on scholarly research." Merely scholarly research. On the other hand, for a book that did indeed originate as a PhD dissertation, this year's winner has received unusually extensive and favorable coverage in such places as the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Economist, the San Francisco Chronicle, USA Today, Chicago Sun-Times, and New Scientist, to name just a few. In his book, Suspect Identities, A History of Fingerprinting and Criminal Identification, Simon Cole notes that, quote, "Fingerprint identification became, without question, the most trusted type of forensic evidence in criminal trials. Juries have convicted, and appeals courts have upheld those convictions, even when a latent fingerprint stood as the only evidence against the defendant. Fingerprint evidence can literally decide matters of life and death." In a meticulously documented and beautifully written example of what we in science studies call opening the black box, Cole then sets out to answer the questions, quote, "How had fingerprint identification been transformed from a subject of debate into something that everyone took for granted? How did fingerprint identification become a virtually incontestable form of truth?" Cole first links the rise of fingerprinting to the state's need, in the context of demographic changes in the Industrial Revolution, to assign stable, bureaucratically verifiable identities to its citizens. He then traces the increasing acceptance of fingerprints in the interwar years as legitimate evidence in criminal trials. In telling the story, he meticulously documents the ways in which this process of acceptance required the bracketing of ambiguities, uncertainties, and inconvenient evidence. In other words, he argues that, judged by the rhetorical standards of science itself, fingerprint analysis is unscientific. This might explain why professional forensic scientists have not reacted kindly to the book. In 2002, Cole's arguments moved from the bookshelf to the courtroom, when Cole was invited to testify as an expert witness in a murder case in which the main evidence of guilt consisted of fingerprints. Largely on the basis of Cole's testimony, federal judge Lewis Pollock ruled that fingerprint evidence should be excluded as scientifically inadequate. In making this ruling, he noted that 9 of 34 government agencies asked to match the fingerprints in the case failed to make the match successfully, thus calling into question the reliability of the technique itself. Although he later rescinded his own ruling, Pollock's ruling sent shockwaves through the legal and police communities, as you can well imagine. The Carson Committee selected Suspect Identities as this year's winner because the book shows, through a sustained case study, how the theoretical perspectives of the 4S community, when taken seriously, can dramatically upend some of our most taken-for-granted assumptions and practices, with profound ramifications for our social and political order. Written in an erudite and accessible style, Simon Cole's book takes our professional community's ideas to the wider audience they deserve. In her work on pesticides and ecology, Rachel Carson also was committed to the difficult task of making rigorous but controversial arguments for a popular audience, arguments many did not want to hear about the dangers of technologies woven deeply into the fabric of society. I am sure that if Amazon.com had existed in Rachel Carson's day, many armchair critics would have posted scathing responses to Silent Spring. I'm also sure that if she were alive today, Rachel Carson would recognize Simon Cole as a kindred spirit and be delighted to see him win a prize named in her honor. Simon, please, can you get your...
This would be a great honor for anybody, but as you can imagine, it is even more affirming for me, given the vituperous reaction of my research subjects, as Hugh explained. I was indeed called a junk scientist by a judge in Brooklyn, but Hugh missed my favorite characterization, which appeared in the Village Voice, in which I was called a publicity-seeking dilettante, bent on marketing my book. Someone clearly didn't understand the academic book market. Reactions like these made it clear to me that I must have been doing something right, but even more so is this recognition from this society. There are some people whose opinions matter to you more than others, and the opinions of this society and its delegated representatives, both as delegated representatives and as scholars themselves, matters a great deal to me, and I just can't tell you how moved I am to have this recognition from this society, which I consider my intellectual home. Finally, I just want to take a little time to thank the many people I could thank, just 3 people who are here in Atlanta. And they're the 3 members of my dissertation committee who are here in Atlanta. Ron Klein, who has allegiances to a different banquet, but is here in Atlanta. And 2 people who are or should be in this room, Trevor Pinch and Sheila Jasnoff, to all 3 of them for their enormous contribution to this work. Thanks very much.
To present the Fleck Prize.
Numbers are believed to be the same everywhere. The English may not count in the same way as the Nigerians, but in the end, 1 is 1, 2 is 2, and 1 and 1 make 2. After David Bloor's initial efforts, the book that drew the unanimous attention of the Fleck Prize Committee in 2002 is going to undermine that certainty, one of the only certainties that until now seems to have withstood yes. Like any good anthropologist, the author asks herself a question that is both very simple and very complicated. How is that Yoruba teachers who introduced elements visibly different from the accepted understanding of Western mathematics, nevertheless managed to teach their pupils the basic principles of those mathematics? Here is what relativism answers. Because the Yoruba can count. This is a good news. Of course, they don't count like the English because of cultural differences, but they count just as well as the English do. In fact, not only the Yoruba count differently. In my 11-year-old daughter's mathematics textbook, the chapter on numbering starts with a little comic strip illustrating how the Bretons, common ancestors of the French and the English, count. And actually, the Bretons counts almost like the Yoruba, with the fingers and with the twos. The message is explicit. The Bretons don't count like we do, but in the end, the count is right. This is what we could call the good news of relativism. I have to confess that relativism has something appealing and reassuring about it. Personally, even after 25 years in France, I still count in Malagasy, in a Madagascan way, which means roughly in orders of magnitude. Although that does not prevent me from counting my money accurately, down to the last cent. Unfortunately, this relativist good news comes with very bad news. The bad news, the author says, is that basically relativism amounts to saying that the difference doesn't matter. It's irrelevant how the Yoruba count. The main thing is that they count, despite the strange ways they have of numbering, generalizing, and talking about the word. So exit the Yoruba and exit the Breton. Now the only problem is that the cost of this closure is huge. It necessarily implies that for the Yoruba, as for the English, numbering is necessarily counting, and generalizing is necessarily quantifying. But what if that is not the case, suggests the author? What if the difference is not what we think it is, or where we think it is? Pessimists would answer that these are pointless questions, since in that case, we wouldn't know anyway. But the author is optimistic and stubborn. Yes, it is possible to tell the difference, she affirms, but the price to pay is not the same, for things have to be put differently. I quote, "What matters is not that numbers work, but that they are being made to work, and the making them to work is a politics," end of quote. To see how numbers can be made to work, we have to get back to the Yoruba classroom. There, we need to observe the emergence of object numbers, but also, and symmetrically, the subjects that enumerate. We need to see how through rituals that are constantly redone, communities of practice create and generate knowledge and knowers. In my opinion, the remarkable thing about this hypothesis is that it requires intellectual rigor. One has to resist the temptation to see numbers behind numerals. One has to refuse facile statements and ready-made formula like plurality of knowledge or hybrid whatever. The author acquired and maintained this resistance because she did not brush aside the resistance of her Yoruba teacher colleagues. For example, she has to take them seriously when they laughed at her because she explained the relativist argument to them, very seriously, saying that their numerical system is different from that of the English, but equally efficient. She could simply have ignored their laughter and been content to talk about relativism in all Western STS circles. But she didn't opt for the easy way out. She preferred Yoruba's laughter. She preferred looking at what was very comic, in the sense of a comedy, in the argument that she had served up to them. She had understood that Yoruba's laughter was a definitive criticism of relativism. In my opinion, that is why the significance of her hypothesis far exceeds the bounds of STS. By placing at the heart of her book the quest for a narrative capable of differentiating between the English and the Yoruba, without insidiously practicing a form of apartheid, the author clearly leads us into a political adventure. At a time when some are afraid of a possible shock between civilizations, while others celebrate the mixing of cultures, the author offers us a message. Yes, differences do exist, but they exist in the actions we take to make collectives emerge and to transform them. On behalf of the Fleck Prize Committee, whose members Kim Fortune, Hideto Nakajima, and Phoebe Biker I'd like to thank, I have the immense pleasure in awarding the 2002 prize to Hélène Ferrand.
Of course, Australians are better known for their performance on the sports field and in the swimming pool than for writing books on African logic. But I can tell you that there is something that the bodies of middle-aged, sort of plain-looking Australian women hold in common with those beautiful bodies of young women and young men who perform so well in the swimming pool. You can imagine me at work checking my email very early before I go to teach, and there's an email from Wes, a very short email, and when I open it and read it, I go, yeah! Yeah, now I know why they do that. So there's something that we share in our bodies. received the Fleck Prize. Ludwig Fleck, I've always felt a connection with through my dear mother-in-law, who was born Jewish in Vienna, more or less at the same time as Fleck. I have a suspicion that since she lived in the same street of Vienna as fairly upper-class people, she probably might have thought, given the way the Habsburg Empire worked, that Ludwig Fleck was a provincial, but we'll ignore that. However, that was a fact of Vienna life. My mother-in-law ended up in an Australian suburb. She wrote an autobiography called Life at Half-Mast. I wonder if Ludwig Fleck felt his life had been lived at half-mast, a life lived amongst the ruins of the Habsburg Empire, the Second World War, the experience of migration. It was a life that she experienced, and possibly he, as a life at half-mast. I've not experienced the life at half-mast. If anything, my life has been over the top. And I mean that not in the World War I trench sense, although sometimes, of course, more in the sense of farce, probably. I was very fortunate to be able to work in the last quarter of the 20th century, the quarter of the 20th century in which 4S came alive. I began the work for this book in 1979. It's taken me a very long time to work it out. If not for 4S, it may never have come out this way. So, Yoruba people, when they have a baby, they wait for the 8th day before the baby is brought out for a naming ceremony, and this ensures that the child is going to stay, the child is not going to withdraw and go back. So I'm feeling that this is the naming ceremony for this object that's now among us. And of course, when Yorubas present their children in the naming ceremony, as I feel this is a naming ceremony for this entity, this book that's out there doing its work, in its own, having its own life, it's usual to thank all the people who've been involved. I want to thank, of course, the teachers and their pupils who were deeply involved. Other people who were involved are recognised in the text of the book. I won't go through them. I want to also recognise the University of Chicago Press and David Brent, the editor. Without the wonderful US academic publishing scene, we would be much poorer as scholars. So I'm grateful to the University of Chicago Press for the work they've put into the book. I'm also grateful, most of all, to 4S and its members. I found a home in this place quite some time ago. The book was written within the family of 4S. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to 4S for continuing to exist. Thank you.